Rose dashed through the trees and came to a stop in the tiny little hollow of a discreet corner well covered by tangled vines. It was a personal hideout of hers, being large enough for only one small child at a time. In it, unbeknownst to anyone save her mother and sister, she had hidden a small statue of a guardian angel in a little recess of the hard earth. She pulled it out now, and held it tenderly with loving, dirty little fingers. The painted face of the statue had been almost completely rubbed off by the harsh elements of its unique abode, but the lovely wings and graceful carven body still remained, and Rose's imagination supplied the facial features. "You just heard my idea, didn't you?" she asked, speaking carefully into the spot where one of the statue's ears might have been. "You'll help me, please, won't you?" She had been taught by her mother about his faithful presence. Her fanciful imagination loved the idea of an invisible friend, and he was a very important component of her happy young life. Her guardian angel was the sharer of all her interests and secrets, and the little statue gave her innocent mind a physical link with the spiritual world. "I want you to be specially involved with my idea," Rose told him, "because you know how to fix all my problems, and I promise my promise, too." She placed her hand over her heart. "Longer than time goes, and as solid as stone, I'll be me for you, and, I won't ever forget you." Her words would have sounded like childish prattle to the average listener, but they were in reference to a secret pact long established. For in her unshakable belief of her angel's loyal companionship, she had promised him in return to be loyal and good and never to change. She'd instilled deep in her mind a horror of the concept of growing up into one of those terribly logical people, the sort who forget an invisible friend. So she had devised a solemn vow for herself, a promise to never change. This promise was where their bond was deepest, for she had found that with his help, any mistake and every misfortune could be amended and restore her to who she had been when she'd first made the vow. And, as she knew from every great tale of valor that her mother had ever told her, all genuine vows are meant for eternity, and true love binds forever. Their secret promise had been repeated over and over again, and necessarily condensed, until it was now summed up within the single earnest words, "I'll never forget you." "I think it's the best idea I've ever had," she said proudly. "Maybe you sent it. And if you'll help me with it all, maybe it'll be the most important thing in my life. You understand, right?" She turned the statue to face her and looked it squarely in the eye holes. A funny little glow ran through her and made her shiver with sudden excitement. The remnants of the features seemed to convey a knowing, even an amused expression. He understood. 2 weeks later, in another little crevice of the orchard, hidden by the overgrowth behind the peach tree groves, another council was held concerning Rose's idea. This time, every kid Rose deemed worthy of inclusion was present, as well as the littler tykes who'd crept in uninvited. "Well, now what do you think of my idea?" asked Rose triumphantly. In the past 2 weeks, 12 games of cops and robbers had been played, and a drastic change in the fortunes of the robbers had come about. The days when each game ended in the discouraging manner of all the robbers caught and the cops playing the smugly satisfied victors had come to an end. Recently, the only way a game ended was when the exasperated, frustrated, and sometimes hysterical cops slumped down on the embarrassingly vacant seats in jail and declared unconditional surrender. These grand victories, everyone agreed, were the result of Rose's radical new strategy, which left the cops apprehensive and wary of every bend in the road or clump of thick foliage, which might harbor some sacrificial little kid who was about to come flying out and offer themselves, sometimes violently, as a prisoner, while the poor cop's more valuable quarry disappeared through the trees. Despite the initial misgivings that some of the robbers had harbored, the method proved so effective that even the most stubborn had relented and heartily joined in the fun. To Rose, whose whole life was geared towards living the heroic and noble story of someone out of a book, these dramatic games were the peak of perfection. For if any child had ever felt that her life was not all that it could be, and longed for adventure and romance with every normal day that passed, it was Rose Brennan. She had attempted to satisfy such feelings with the countless stories she wrote in her head, in all of which she was the humble heroine, and the fantastic fairy tale games she concocted for her companions to play. Still, at the end of every game, there was reality waiting to squelch her again, and into every story came the nagging thought that she wasn't really such a heroine and never would have the chance to be. So now, with new adventures and fresh causes to fight for, Rose was the happiest general under the age of 10 in the whole state of California. "Didn't I tell you this idea was going to turn out great?" demanded Rose triumphantly, directing her question mostly towards Tom and Hank, who both nodded humbly. "I'll admit," said Hank, "I wasn't quite sure about the whole thing at first, but we've shown ourselves better than we thought we were. I think it's a great success." "So do I. I think it's the best thing you've ever come up with," said Kate Mitchell, seated by Jenny Pierce, who was once again a reconciled robber. "I think it's marvelous," said Jenny, "and I'll not let Keith talk me into being a cop anymore, because I know us robbers are going to win, thanks to you, Rose." Jenny was Kate's age. Her disposition was gentle and always sweet, and with the infamous Clump as her younger sister, this fact sometimes seemed incredible. Kate's and Jenny's high praises made Rose glow with satisfaction all over again. Her confidence in her younger friends was always firm and unshakable, and it was partly this that made all the younger kids her loyal followers. Suddenly, one of these younglings arose and took the floor. It was Mick Hogan, the third boy of the Hogan family, and Hank's minor by 4 years. Seeing that his brother was so respected, he had decided to speak up. Mick was a wild, rough, and very opinionated little boy. At the time of this narrative, he was 5 years old and desperately wanted to be treated like the man that he was. Due to his limited vocabulary, a chronic lisp, and his unavoidable charm, this desire was rarely fulfilled. "Hi, Schweeny Shayshumpton," he suddenly declared boldly, pointing at himself impressively with a stubby but very dignified forefinger. Most of the kids glanced at each other in bewilderment over this unintelligible proclamation, and even Rose, who was a very close friend of Mick's, seeing as she treated him as an equal, which he quite appreciated, looked to his older brother Hank for a translation. Hank's interpreting services were sometimes required even by their parents. "He wants to say something," explained Hank. "Oh," said Rose. "Go ahead, Mick, we're listening." Mick, puffing his chest out proudly at such an invitation, took a deep breath, cleared his throat carefully, and said quite distinctly, "If yoi's making for a club out of your idea, yoi's need to give it a name." In the silence that followed this stunning oration, Bridie Hogan, Mick's 4-year-old sister, toddled over to Rose, who was sitting cross-legged on the ground. Bridie plopped into Rose's lap with a contented little sigh, whilst sucking earnestly on a much-used finger. Rose, still puzzling over Mick's emphatic words, gave her little friend an absent pat on the head and again turned to Hank for aid. "If we're what?" she asked quietly, keeping her eyes on the impressive Mick as she whispered sidelong towards Hank. "He said something about if you're making a new club out of your idea, then you should give it a name." "Oh," said Rose again. She glanced up. "Hey, he's got a point." "Yes," said Carrie. "We can't just keep calling it this thing. That doesn't sound very official. The maneuver needs a title, and if we're making a regular club out of it, we should have a title too." Rose furrowed her imaginative brow in thought. "Let's see. What's a nice heroic-sounding name?" "The Heroes," said Kate. "The Warriors?" suggested Jenny. "Nah, too common," said Rose. "We need something nobody has ever used before." "The Ants," said Hank suddenly. When bombarded with exasperated, inquiring looks, he explained, "I've been learning all about ants in my science book. They're real neat. When they have to cross water, one gives up his life so the others can walk across him in safety. That's heroic, isn't it?" "Well," admitted Rose gravely, "it's heroic all right, but it wouldn't be right for us to do that since we're people, and I suppose ants just don't know any better. Besides, I just can't see people taking us seriously if we go around calling ourselves the ants." "I don't think they're going to take us very seriously anyhow," muttered Tom Mitchell. Rose was about to reply in protest of this pessimism when they all heard agitated voices rising from the direction of jail. Rose's expression brightened. "You don't think they will?" she asked Tom. "Come on. I want to show you all something, but be quiet. We don't want them to hear us." Taking little Bridie by the hand and putting a warning finger to her lips, Rose led her small army, single file, through the shrubbery by a secret route up to the vicinity of jail. Clump came scampering up through the crowd practically on all fours as they progressed, with Mick Hogan beside her. Seeing that little Bridie was holding a place of honor in the enterprise, Rose's hand, Clump and Mick also came toddling along to the front, shushing each other loudly and endeavoring to act in a manner that they both considered mature and very military. When jail was less than 10 feet away, Rose crouched down in the brush on her knees with her followers ranged carefully around her, and stealthily pushed aside the sheltering leaves so that they could see plainly the scene that was unfolding on the fateful patio. Keith was dominating the conversation. He was pacing back and forth round the boundaries of the cop's domain, calling down in a loud voice every malady within his imagination upon the juvenile generals. He scolded and fumed, and he often came within a little of endangering the balance of his slender build with the force of his energetic lateral demonstrations. Neve, his fellow cop, was seated in one of the patio chairs, watching him with undisguised amusement. For Neve, the enmities of the game never went further than the scene of action, since she and Rose chose to live in harmony together with that single delicate subject set aside. Yet even on her own, Neve was good-natured enough to know how to lose well. Luke and Jim were also included in the cops' strategy meeting. They were too old to be included in the younger kids' military planning, and too bored to be excluded from the cops, so the two big boys were sharing Neve's amusement at Keith's exhibition and enjoying a moment of rest. Of late, they hadn't been quite sure what to make of their sudden protection by Rose's army, but they knew that they couldn't interfere with the powerful action of little kids on a new mission. Jim surmised it was something out of Rose's inventive mind, and Luke usually didn't bother to conjecture on the strange customs of the miners, so they simply accepted the sudden assistance of the ants, or whatever it is they've decided to call themselves. Jim was now sitting on a rickety patio table and amusing himself by pulling a loose thread out of his ripped sock, which was on his foot, which he'd propped up onto the table to rest it from its usual fleeing labors. Luke was lounged sleepily in a nearby chair, absently wishing he had an interesting book on hand, while he listened to his younger brother's discourse against the world. "And what makes it so ridiculous," stormed Keith as he strode around his listeners for the 100th time, "is that they're such little kids we shouldn't have to take them seriously at all, but they keep on winning." In the bushes, Rose gave Tom a triumphant nudge. "See?" she whispered through Bridie's hair at him. "They do take us seriously." "They don't care at all about throwing their freedom away for the sake of each other," continued Keith, stopping and leaning against the chair in which the stately Luke had now started to doze with a sympathetic look on his face. "They don't have anything to lose, so they aren't afraid to try anything." "Just like ants," Hank whispered loudly in his bush. "Shh," hissed several of his companions. "And they're so unpredictable," said Keith, resuming his pacing around his audience. "When I chase people nowadays, I actually run slower because I never know when one of them is going to jump out and tackle me. I've tried being ready to run around them, but it never works. They pop up and land themselves in your way like little stone walls." Suddenly, Rose leapt out of the bushes with a whoop, knocking little Bridie flat on her back and bringing Luke back to wakefulness with a start. "That's it!" she cried joyfully, dashing up to Jael with an ecstatic smile. "That's it! We'll call ourselves the Stonewalls!" As the big kids watched in amazement, the entire army of little kids came charging out of the bushes, loudly agreeing and hollering about their sudden new name. "Thanks, Keith," cried Rose, throwing her sturdy arms around the discomfited cop and giving him a swift hug. "That's a great name." "I Hawaii by and I," stammered Keith in sudden speechlessness. "We really are like Stonewalls," said Hank proudly. "You can't move us or defeat us, and you'll always find us getting in the way between good guys and bad guys." "It's the perfect name for you," said the enthusiastic Neve, who was really very proud of Rose's successful idea. At this, Keith closed his open mouth, trying to look indignant, but soon found himself grinning, honestly pleased by his accidental success. "It has more meaning than you think," he said to Rose, "because you could be named after the great Civil War hero Stonewall Jackson. He's known for being one of the bravest men of all time, and when he fought in battle, they said he was like a stone wall. They said that he was so brave he just couldn't be moved. He was all noble and heroic like you're always talking about, Rose." Rose could have turned a handspring on the spot, she was so happy. "This is what my friends were always meant to be," she thought with much satisfaction. "I'm turning them all noble and heroic, and it suits 'em." All their petty problems and minor faults seemed lost in the glory of it. "Then Stonewall Jackson will be our patron, and for our other patrons I name St. Odran, my favorite saint whom Carrie can never remember, and my guardian angel." "How'll we set up the Stonewall army?" asked Hank, all thoughts of ants completely forgotten. "What kind of ranking should we use?" "Generals and captains and lieutenants, like in the real army?" suggested Tom. "I guess," said Rose, "but we need something original as well, like numbers." "Yes," cried Carrie, "I hereby name, with the assent of all my fellow Stonewalls, Rose Brennan, Stonewall 1, the complete commander and leader of the Stonewalls. All those in favor say, okay." Amid a chorus of loud okays, Rose blushed happily and modestly accepted the title. She accepted both the title and its responsibility, never guessing the fated life that was then placed upon her young shoulders. As the clamor died down again, she raised her hands to command complete silence and began the task of creating her army. "And I, Stonewall 1, she said proudly, hereby confer upon my dearest friend, Carrie Mitchell, the honor of right-hand man, or girl, second in command of the entire Stonewall army. I name thee Stonewall 2. Carrie blushed as the cheers and chattering started again. Rose hushed them down and continued, "And to Hank Hogan goes the right of third in command as Stonewall 3, she proclaimed. "We 3 shall be the generals, and by us the governing of the Stonewalls shall be determined. And if ever the perils of battle shall bring the hand of death down upon me, then shall Stonewall 2 be granted the sovereign power of the Stonewalls, and if she should die in action, Stonewall 3 shall then rule your ranks. So the commander of the Stonewalls proclaims it." The older kids continued smiling maturely as they wondered what books Rose had been reading lately, but they joined dutifully in the cheers following this grim announcement. Then, as the afternoon sun began to fade behind the lovely clouds of sunset, and the orchard shadows lengthened, the 3 Stonewall generals named the following Stonewalls in the ranks they would hold until their dying days. Kate Mitchell as the honored Stonewall 4, first of the non-general Stonewalls, Jenny Pierce as Stonewall 5, Little Bridie Hogan as Stonewall 6, the very proud Mick Hogan as Stonewall 7, and lastly, Tom Mitchell as Stonewall 8. Clump refused to be inaugurated until she was promised the honored number of 10, which she then believed to be the largest existing number in the world, and only after she'd been repeatedly assured that she would not have to climb over any real stone walls during the games. Just as these decisions were being concluded, and it was being debated whether to allow the big boys, perhaps even the cops, into the ranks of the Stonewalls, Mrs. Brennan came down into the orchard, bearing a heaping bowl of strawberries and a pitcher of lemonade. As she has opportunely appeared upon a scene of pivotal importance, and will remain a prominent component of this story, she warrants a moment's private notice, lest we lose her within the distracting tumult of her brood. Mrs. Brennan was charming and engaging, and very understanding about children's matters. Though a single parent, and the sole source of her little family's income, she somehow contrived to spend a wonderful amount of time with her girls and their companions. The large room in their house, which was her office, was a place of amusement and sanctuary to all of them, while her ever-ready comfort was sought and valued by many. With her golden red hair, the same color as Neve's, and her graceful, athletic figure, she appeared younger than she was, as though one just blossoming from girlhood. Only the sharp wisdom reflected in her face, born of many a past experience, and the soft melancholy wrinkles about her eyes as she smiled, gave witness to the years she had spent as a tireless, selfless mother, deprived of a young husband in his prime. She had been taught life's lessons on many a hard road, amid tragedy and sufferings which were entirely unknown to many who knew her. In appearance, she was very similar to her elder daughter, but she understood her younger daughter with a perception and keen insight of which even Rose was not aware. Cheerful of spirit, undaunted through any trial, she was found downright enchanting by those around her, in business or home life. It often seemed to the other mothers that Mrs. Brennan was more at ease with their children than with adults, and most of the time they were right. The kids, in return, loved Mrs. Brennan, and naturally included her in every juvenile secret and childish plot. Rose and her mother were inseparable friends, and so Mrs. Brennan was more aware of the robbers' new strategy than anyone else. As she appeared on the scene in its present flurry, the youngsters were so anxious to tell her about their new name that the strawberries and lemonade lasted almost a full minute and a half before being devoured. "Named after Stonewall Jackson," said Mom. "You couldn't have made a better choice. He was just your type, Rose." "That's what Keith said," spluttered Rose through a mouthful of strawberries. "I'm going to look him up in my history book." "We'll do it first thing Monday morning," agreed Mom. "And if I know you, we'll be daydreaming about him so much that we won't concentrate on any other schoolwork." She rumpled Rose's wild hair affectionately, speaking through the experience only a teacher could boast. "Do you have a war cry yet?" she asked. "Let's see," said Rose thoughtfully. "What's a good war cry, gang?" "Long live the Stonewalls!" shouted Carrie. "That's our battle cry," assented Rose, "but we need something we can shout right after a great jailbreak, like a slogan or a verse or something." "Let's take something from one of Father Finn's books," suggested Tom. "We've always borrowed from them, Rose." Rose shook her head. "It has to be original, just like us." She muttered to herself for a moment and then said, "How about, no cops, no kids, no bad guys ever can defeat us, 'cause we're the mighty Stonewalls, and nobody'll ever beat us." Though Rose was somewhat lacking as a poet, Her spirit and enthusiasm set everybody cheering again. After a few more times through, all the Stonewalls learned their rallying cheer, while Tom started trying to write their future national anthem in his head. "Well," said Hank in satisfaction as he finished the last strawberry and sighed contentedly, "it looks like the Stonewalls are firmly established and already rolling towards victory." "Yep," said Rose. She gazed out over the beautiful orchard, at the lovely sunset, then around at all her friends, so loyal and wonderful. They were already chattering on again, all at the same time, but the cacophony was pleasant and homelike to her ears. She thought of the great things that had happened that day, and of all the even greater things that were to come, and her little heart was full to bursting. "Yup, we're the Stonewalls," she repeated, "and nothing will ever defeat us."